The Argosy comic book price guide was the very first official comic book price guide ever published in American history, published in 1965 from the Argosy Bookshop, which was a bookstore in Los Angeles, California, that dealt in a lot of collectible back-issue comic books. In 1965, the hobby was new. Nobody really had a guide for the prices. And so at this time, they published a small booklet, and it listed 5,000 comics, and it listed a mint condition price only for each book. And it featured basically the most common Golden Age titles, with a small assortment of the most popular Silver Age titles, which at that time were not old at all. So you have to keep in mind, it's 1965, and Marvel had only started launching their new superhero titles in the past few years, and they were just catching on. They were trendy at this time, the hot new thing, and so this price guide would actually list them. So when we see some of the prices eventually, it's actually quite surprising how high some of them were. But let's start by looking at what were the most valuable comic books in the very first price guide in 1965. Well, Action Comics #1 has always been considered the benchmark for the most important historical comic book. With the first appearance of Superman, he created a new genre of popularity, helped create the big boom of 1940s comic sales, and therefore we see Action Comics #1 is top of the list from DC Comics, and it has a hefty $100 price tag in 1965 for a mint copy. Now keep in mind, people did not know how to grade comics accurately back then. So when they talked about mint, they were considering this to be a decent high quality copy. But by today's standards, that might be a fine copy graded about 6.0. If we compare the rest of the list, we'll see that Marvel Comics #1 also had a $100 price tag. So here we have the key DC and Marvel book at the top of the list. Marvel was called Timely Comics back in the Golden Age. After that, we see the first appearance of Batman, predictably, is high up on the list, and Detective Comics #27 is the highest ranking comic that is not a #1 issue. And the only other comic that makes the top 10 most valuable comics that is not a first issue is All-Star Comics #3 from 1940, featuring the first appearance of Justice Society of America. So, predictably, DC dominates the top 10 with the majority of the titles, as they still do to this day, 50 years later in comic book collecting. There's only 15 comics on the list with a price tag of $50 or more. Again, keep in mind inflation. Comic books only cost 12 cents in 1965, and so a $50 price tag really made these books look valuable. And considering that most of these books have now been proven to have only around 100 or so copies in existence in all condition, it would have been interesting when they put this price guide together that, you know, a lot of dealers had literally never seen these books before. And of course, there are, due to that, a few errors. And we'll even see some errors in the early Overstreet price guides because people were guessing on some titles. Looking at the list, you'll see I've also, just for comparison's sake, I have put the Overstreet price guide values from the 2016 guide just to give you a comparison of how much the high grade price has changed over a 51-year period. And of course, Action Comics #1 was the most valuable then, and it still is today, but now it's not worth $100, it's worth $2.8 million. And if you look at the profit over that time period, for the price of buying one copy of Action Comics in 1965, you could now buy 28,000 copies of the same book. We're looking just at the actual profit margin here. Now, inflation since 1965 has probably gone up 7 or 8 times. So if you had left your money in the bank, every $100 you would have put in the bank 50 years ago would be worth approximately $800 now. So, or you could have bought an Action Comics #1 for $100, and instead of having your money turn into $800 with inflation over 50 years, you would have 28,000 times your money instead of 8 times. So if you look at the list, even the slow-moving books, profit-wise, have still been huge. One of the most interesting books to make this list high ranking is Jackpot #1 from 1941. This is the highest, most valuable comic from MLJ Comics, which would turn into Archie Comics. And this early superhero comic ranks number 14 most valuable comic of all time in the Argosy price guide. Now it's worth $5,800 in near mint, still a huge profit, 116 times higher. It has gone up in that time period, but it is by far the least profitable comic on this list. The other most profitable books we can see, Detective Comics #27, also All-American Comics #16, featuring the first appearance of Green Lantern, has gone up over 12,000 times in value. And yet, if you look at the list, there's still even more key books. Superman #1, over 14,000 times higher. Batman #1, over 7,000 times higher. Some of the surprises we find on this list, let's just go through the list and look a little bit closely. Timely Comics has 2 comics in the top 10. Once we pass DC and Timely, we find the most valuable comic book of all time from not those publishers is Captain Marvel Adventures #1 from Fawcett Comics 1941. This features a Captain Marvel story. He was very popular at this time, and this one is done by Jack Kirby. What's interesting is that this is the most valuable Captain Marvel comic at the time, and yet it is not his first appearance, which ranks lower on the list at number 22. In Whiz Comics, the first issue was worth $40 as opposed to $50 for the Captain Marvel Adventures. So it could be the title alone seemed to be of more significance at the time. Again, Jackpot #1, surprising that it ranks so high because it does not rank even in the top 300 comics now. So ranking at 14 was quite high. The second appearance of Batman in Detective Comics #28 ranks quite high. And in fact, it ranks higher than the second appearance of Superman in Action Comics #2. A couple other surprises on the list. Zip Comics #1 from MLJ from 1940 ranks at number 17. Still very high ranking. That comic has not had as good growth over time, and it also does not rank in the top 300 now. Marvel Mystery Comics has a bunch of titles on the list. Master Comics #1 from Fawcett is their third title in the top 30, featuring the first appearance of Master Man. World's Best #2 ranks as the 36th most valuable comic book of all time at this point, and yet interestingly, that comic does not even exist. It was just presumed that World's Best continued, but in fact we would later discover that World's Best changed its title and became World's Finest with #2. Therefore, World's Finest does not have a #1 issue, and World's Best does not have a #2 issue. This was not known in the 1960s because people had not seen these books or been able to verify this information. The oldest comic on the entire list is Detective Comics #1 from 1937, another DC title, classic first issue. If we look at the titles that have the most issues on the chart, Detective Comics from DC ranks easily at #1 with 6 different issues worth $30 or more. Marvel Mystery Comics has 4 from Timely Comics, and All-Star Comics had already shown its dominance early on with 3 high-ranking price tag. This is a very popular series that were collected at this time, already established by the mid-1960s. Here's some interesting facts about the first guide. Comic book fandom was new at this time, and the first comic book conventions had just started in 1964, which is just prior to the release of this book. This guide was select to the most popular Golden and Silver Age superhero titles only, and therefore many other genre books and other titles are missing from this book. There are 5,000 books listed, but that is still a small assortment of the number of comics published since the 1930s. If we want to see how big the Silver Age market, it wasn't yet called that, but at this time, Fantastic Four #1 was considered the key Marvel Silver Age book, and it was at this time only 4 years old. but now had a $6 mint price tag in the Argosy price guide. Amazing Fantasy 15, with the first appearance of Spider-Man, was considered to be worth considerably more than Amazing Spider-Man #1 at the time. And Showcase #4 was established already by far as the most valuable DC Silver Age comic, worth more than double of any other DC title from the 50s or 60s. Comic collecting had been pushed in the 60s by those hunting out EC horror comics and the new boom with the resurgence of superhero comics from DC and Marvel. This is the first official price guide, and it lists 5,000 comics printed over the past 30 years. Keep in mind, when this guide came out, it had a price tag of $5 when comics were still only 12 cents. Would have been a very expensive book to purchase, and I'm sure many didn't. Most collectors had likely never paid a high price tag for a back issue comic at this point. In fact, most places you could only find a comic book at this time were in back issue bins at bookstores, and you probably could have bought them for half of cover price. Comic sales as collectibles were making the news for the first time, with record sales of Action Comics #1. There were 47 comic books listed in the price guide with a value of $30 or higher in mint condition. 25 of the 47 books are from DC Comics, and 15 of those titles are from Timely Comics. So that is 40 of the 47 books on the list. That leaves only 7 other Golden Age comics from all other publishers combined. This includes 3 from Fawcett Comics, 2 from MLJ, 1 from Lev Gleason, and 1 from Quality. Detective Comics #31 is the highest issue number of any title to make the chart. And 28 of the 47 comics on the list are all #1 issues, with 9 of the 47 being #2 issues. The majority of the comics on the list are from the year 1940. There are 17 of the 47 listed, and 1941 is close behind with 14 of the 47. 1939 is in third place with 10 of the 47 most valuable comics of all time at that point. Detective Comics, as I mentioned, #1 is the only early issue, 1937, on the list, and All Select Comics from Timely Comics is the only comic dated 1942 or newer to have a value of $30 or higher. Now, let's specifically look at the most important Silver Age comics, and let's see how they were ranking in the very first Argosy price guide, and you'll see we can even compare it to the first Overstreet price guide 5 years later. These are the mint or near mint prices at the time. You'll see that we're using what's currently considered the most valuable Silver Age comics now. This wasn't the case necessarily back then, though some of them definitely had made their mark. Again, Showcase #4, with the first appearance of the Silver Age Flash, was worth $7.50 in the Argosy price guide in mint shape. That was the most valuable comic book of the Silver Age at that point. You'll see Fantastic Four #1 is close behind at $6, and Amazing Fantasy #15 was close behind that with $5. After that, the price drops quite a bit. Amazing Spider-Man #1 is worth $3.50. And then we have Flash 105 from 1959, the first issue of the relaunch, worth $3. And Showcase #22 with the first Silver Age Green Lantern, also worth $3. After that, $2.50 seems to be the going rate for the majority of the Silver Age key issues at that time. Now again, keep in mind, comics were still only 12 cents in 1965, and therefore these price tags really appeared quite hefty. The newest comic on this list is Daredevil #1 from Marvel Comics, so it was only 1 year old. It was listed with a value of $1.50. So again, that is over 12 times cover price in a single year. And we'll see there's a few other books with prices similar to that. Tales to Astonish 27 and X-Men #1 both had a $1.50 price tag as well. These are considered to be on the cheap end, therefore these were less popular titles or not deemed to have as much value. On the list, we'll see some books had even lesser value. Superman's Girlfriend Lois Lane #1, now considered a major key book, wasn't considered so much at that time. It was 7 years old, but it was a girl title, and it was worth $1 for the #1 issue. The Argosy Price Guide actually didn't even include some titles that were not quite as popular. Adventure Comics, the entire line, is not listed in Argosy at all, as is Brave and the Bold. And Our Army at War, being a non-superhero title, that title is not listed at all either. So those books have no value listed. But if they were listed, realistically, they would be cheaper. It's fascinating to see how much the comic book industry has grown from these early days. Anybody lucky enough to be a comic book collector, especially those dealers who actually got their hands on some of these classic key golden and silver age books, would have got them for literally pennies in some cases if they were lucky enough to ever get a copy. And prices were all over the board because, of course, the Argosy Price Guide was not really well known. It would not have been carried by really other bookstores or comic dealers at the time. So these prices would not have even really been well established until the Overstreet Price Guide became a common occurrence and the Bible of the comic book industry.